Her name was Sarah Miller, and when her husband walked out, he didn't slam the door. He didn't shout. He simply placed his house keys on the granite countertop, a soft clink that sounded louder than a gunshot, and left her standing there, 6 months pregnant. One hand rested instinctively on her stomach. The other gripped the edge of a kitchen island that suddenly felt too big for one person. Plus one. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument they'd ever had. Sarah was 34. She had done everything the book said to do. Built a stable career, bought the sensible SUV, trusted the man she loved. Now, with a Pacific Northwest winter approaching and a child on the way, she found herself taping up cardboard boxes alone, wondering how a life could unravel so neatly. That was when the letter arrived. It wasn't from David, but from a county clerk's office in rural Oregon she barely remembered. It informed her that her grandmother, Elise, had left her a property. Not a trust fund, not a condo in Portland, but a house buried deep in the Cascade Mountains. Sarah hadn't seen the place since she was a little girl. She only remembered the smell of wood smoke and her grandmother's voice saying, "Some places hold you up when the world lets go." With nowhere else to turn, Sarah drove south. Her car climbed the winding logging roads, the towering Douglas firs closing in like a curtain, cell service fading to zero. With every mile, her fear mixed with something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. Fragile, trembling, but alive. She arrived with exhaustion soaking into her bones. The drive had taken all day. Her back ached, and the baby shifted inside her with quiet insistence. When she finally turned off the gravel access road and saw the house, she almost didn't stop. It didn't look welcoming. It barely looked like a house. The structure sat half-buried into the slope of the mountain, as if the earth itself had decided to swallow it whole. The roof wasn't shingles or tin. It was a continuation of the hillside grass, covered in wild fescue and moss. The walls were thick, made of timber darkened by decades of rain and packed earth. Sarah parked the car and sat there for a long moment, the engine ticking as it cooled. She pressed her palm to her stomach. "I know," she whispered to the baby. "I'm scared too." When she stepped inside, she braced herself for the smell of dampness and rot, the hollow scent of abandonment. Instead, she smelled dried sage, old cedar, and something grounded. Outside, the November air was sharp enough to cut, frost clinging to the shadows. But inside, the cold softened. It wasn't the dry, artificial heat of a furnace. It was a steady, living warmth, as if the walls themselves were holding on to the summer sun. Sarah closed the heavy timber door and leaned against it. The house didn't open outward to the view. It folded inward, stepping back into the mountain like a secret. It felt less like entering a building and more like being accepted into a sanctuary. She sat down on a low bench carved directly into the adobe wall and finally let herself breathe. For the first time since the keys hit the counter, she cried. Not politely, but fully. She cried for the marriage she believed in and for the terrifying reality of raising a child alone. And when the tears finally slowed, she realized something unsettling. The house didn't echo her grief. It held it. When Sarah woke, morning light was spilling across the stone floor in soft, angled bands. She stretched, her stiff limbs protesting the night spent on the makeshift bed, and noticed something strange. The farther she moved toward the back of the house, deeper into the hillside, the warmer the air felt. It wasn't the dry, dusty heat of a forced air vent. It was radiant, consistent, like standing next to a sun-baked rock in July. Curious now, she explored more deliberately. Tucked into a recessed alcove in the central hallway, she found a stack of old papers wrapped in oilcloth. Her hands shook slightly as she unfurled them on the heavy oak table. They were blueprints, hand-drawn, precise, and annotated in her grandmother's sharp cursive. Sarah traced the lines with her finger. Grandma Elise hadn't just built a cabin, she had engineered a biosystem. There were diagrams of thermal mass, notes on passive solar gain, and arrows indicating airflow channels buried under the floor. "The house breathes so you don't have to freeze," a margin note read. Sarah stared at the paper. This place wasn't just a retreat. It was a solution. That afternoon, the peace was shattered. A low, grinding mechanical hum drifted up from the valley, followed by the piercing beep, beep, beep of heavy machinery backing up. The sound was alien and violent against the backdrop of the quiet forest. Sarah pulled on her coat and walked to the edge of the ridge. Down below, on the logging road that bordered her grandmother's property line, trucks were idling. Men in neon orange safety vests were driving wooden stakes into the soft earth, tying them off with bright pink survey tape. Her stomach tightened. Not from the baby this time, but from instinct. She made her way down the slope, the mud slick under her boots. A man noticed her approach. He was tall, clean-shaven, wearing a white hard hat and a jacket with a corporate logo stitched over the chest. Apex Geo Solutions. He watched her come down with the practiced patience of someone used to handling complaints. "Ma'am?" he called out before she reached the road. His voice was polite but firm, the kind of tone used by police officers and insurance adjusters. "This is an active assessment zone. Liability rules require you to keep a safe distance." "This is private property," Sarah said, breathless from the descent. "The road is county easement," the man replied smoothly. He stepped forward and extended a hand, though he didn't smile. "Robert Thorne, site engineer. We're just running some standard geological surveys. Nothing invasive yet." "Surveying for what? Resource density? Seismic stability?" Thorne looked past her, up toward the strange grass-roofed house blending into the hill. "Though, to be honest, I'm surprised anyone is living up there. That structure isn't on our current GIS maps." "It's been here for 40 years, Sarah said defensively. "Well," Thorne adjusted his hard hat, "you might feel some vibrations over the next few days. We're doing deep ground sonar pulsing. It's harmless." Harmless. The word hung in the cold air. Sarah walked back up to the house, her pulse steady but sharp. Fear crept in slowly, the way the cold does when you ignore it too long. That night, the harmlessness ended. Sarah was sitting on the floor, reading through the journals again, when the ground trembled. It wasn't an earthquake. It didn't roll. It was a sharp, sudden jolt, like a heavy door slamming deep underground. Dust sifted down from the timber beams. The house didn't creak. It groaned, a low-frequency sound of pressure shifting against stone. Sarah placed her hand flat against the packed earth wall. The warmth was still there, but now, beneath it, she felt a subtle, rhythmic vibration. The machines down in the valley had stopped for the night, but the mountain was still moving. Sarah looked at the blueprints spread out on the table, then at the dark window. Her grandmother's notes had mentioned pressure zones and fault pockets. The engineers called it standard procedure. But the house, this living, breathing thing, was telling her something else entirely. They weren't just surveying the land. They were waking it up. The rain arrived on Tuesday, a relentless gray atmospheric river typical of the Pacific Northwest, soaking the Cascade foothills and turning the logging roads into treacherous ribbons of mud. Inside the house, the air grew tighter, heavy with an unspoken static. Sarah found the source of the unease in the lowest level of the house, a root cellar cut deep into the slope. A hairline crack had appeared in the adobe wall. It wasn't crumbling, but it was hissing faintly. Heat radiated from it, smelling of sulfur and wet stone. She checked her grandmother's blueprints again. The note was circled in red ink. Geothermal vent proximity. Unstable if disturbed. They weren't just shaking the ground. They were piercing a pressurized vein. Then came the sound. It wasn't a roar, but a sickening slurp, followed by the agonizing crunch of metal twisting. Sarah grabbed the oilcloth bundle of blueprints and shoved her feet into her muck boots. She didn't walk to the ridge this time. She ran, her breath smoking in the cold air, one hand protective over her belly, sliding on the wet pine needles. Down at the cut line, chaos had broken the orderly routine of the work crew. A massive section of the muddy slope had given way, sliding silently downward like melting wax. A yellow excavator sat at a precarious 45-degree angle, its tracks half swallowed by a sudden sinkhole that had opened where solid ground used to be moments ago. Men were shouting, scrambling back toward the trucks. Robert Thorne stood near the edge of the slide, his hard hat dripping rain, shouting into a radio. "Stop!" Sarah's voice cut through the noise. She scrambled down the embankment, ignoring the mud slicking her jeans. Thorne turned, his face pale under the brim of his hat. "Ma'am, you need to clear the area immediately. This is an active hazard zone." "It's not just a hazard," Sarah shouted, thrusting the damp blueprints at him. "It's a thermal pocket. You're drilling directly into a pressure valve." Thorne looked at her, then at the old, hand-drawn papers she was holding. He looked ready to dismiss her again, to call security. "We ran the seismic scans, Ms. Miller. The bedrock is solid. The bedrock is fractured," Sarah corrected him, her voice shaking not from fear but from adrenaline. She pointed to the cross-section diagram Elise had drawn 40 years ago. "My grandmother built this house to float on that instability, to breathe with it. Your equipment isn't listening to the mountain, it's breaking it. Look at the steam, Robert." Thorne froze. He looked past her shoulder. From the fresh, muddy scar in the earth where the excavator lay tilted, faint wisps of white vapor were rising, curling up to dissolve into the rain. It wasn't exhaust, it was geothermal heat. He stared at the steam, then back at the pregnant woman standing in the mud, holding a sheaf of papers like a shield. The corporate indifference cracked. He was an engineer, and he knew physics didn't negotiate. If that steam was real, his crew was sitting on a bomb. "Shut it down," Thorne barked into his radio, his voice dropping an octave. "All units, kill the engines. Pull back to the secondary perimeter, now." The roar of the diesel engines died away one by one, leaving only the sound of the rain drumming on hard hats and the forest floor. Sarah stood there, shivering now that the anger was burning off. Thorne wiped rain from his face and looked at her with a new expression. It wasn't annoyance anymore. It was respect, tinged with a heavy dose of fear. "Can I see those papers?" he asked quietly. Sarah didn't hand them over. She stepped back, clutching them against her chest. "You can look at them," she said. "But we talk at the house, away from the machines." For the first time since she arrived, Sarah wasn't the intruder. She was the one holding the ground. The suspension order from the county came through 2 days after the mudslide, but Winter didn't wait for the paperwork. A massive low-pressure system stalled over the Cascades, dumping 3 feet of snow in 48 hours. The world beyond the ridge vanished behind a curtain of white. The access road, treacherous enough in the rain, was now completely impassable. The trucks were gone. The flags were buried. Sarah was truly alone, but for the first time in her life, isolation didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like clarity. The power grid in the valley flickered and died under the weight of the ice. But Grandma Elise's house didn't blink. The thermal mass of the floors, which had soaked up the weak winter sun during the day, released a steady, radiant warmth throughout the night. The house wasn't fighting the storm. It was waiting it out. When the first contraction hit, it was midnight. It started as a dull ache in her lower back, tightening like a fist. Sarah sat up in the heavy silence, breathing through the sudden sharpness. She checked her phone. No service. The landline was dead. The line likely snapped somewhere down the mountain by a fallen heavy branch. Panic flared for a second. The old Sarah, the one who planned everything in spreadsheets and feared the unknown, wanted to scream. But the panic didn't take root. She walked the length of the house, her hand trailing along the rough, cool adobe walls. Outside, the wind howled through the Douglas firs, a wild thrashing sound. Inside, the silence was absolute. "You are not trapped," she whispered to herself, her voice steady in the dark. "You are sheltered." The labor was long. Hours blurred into a rhythm of pain and respite. Sarah moved to the central hearth, where she had kept a small fire burning, not for heat, but for light. She didn't fight the pain. She remembered the lesson from the landslide. Resistance causes the collapse. Flow allows survival. She thought of David, leaving the keys on the counter. She thought of her corporate job in the city, the polite smiles, the constant apologizing for taking up space. That life felt like a movie she had watched years ago. Around 4 a.m., the pain shifted, becoming something primal and demanding. Sarah squatted near the hearth, gripping the edge of the heavy oak table. She didn't feel weak. She felt like the mountain itself, under immense pressure, but shifting to accommodate new life. There were no doctors, no beeping monitors, no sterile hospital lights. Just the smell of wood smoke, the warmth of the earth-packed floor, and the fierce, undeniable will of a mother. When Emily arrived, she didn't cry immediately. She was small and warm, blinking against the firelight. Sarah wrapped her in the thick wool blankets she'd prepared, pulling her close to her chest. "I've got you," Sarah sobbed, tears cutting tracks through the sweat on her face. "We're okay. We're here." The baby let out a sharp, strong cry, announcing her presence to the empty room. Outside, the wind finally began to die down. The storm broke just before dawn. Sarah sat by the east-facing window, exhausted but buzzing with a strange, electric energy. She watched the sun crest over the ridge, turning the pristine, untouched snow into a field of blinding diamonds. The world looked brand new. She looked down at her daughter, sleeping soundly. Sarah realized she hadn't just given birth to a child. She had given birth to a new version of herself. The woman who had driven up this mountain terrified and broken was gone. In her place was someone who knew that she could survive the winter. Someone who understood that safety wasn't given by a husband or a paycheck. It was built, stone by stone, from the inside out. The house held them both, silent and steady as the new day began. Spring in the Cascades doesn't arrive politely, it erupts. Weeks after the storm, the heavy snowpack began to recede, revealing patches of wet, dark earth that smelled of pine needles and survival. The access road finally cleared, turning from a trap back into a driveway. When a vehicle finally crunched up the gravel, it wasn't a rescue team. It was Robert Thorne. He drove a different truck this time. No drilling rig in tow. He stepped out, holding a thick binder, and walked toward the porch where Sarah sat rocking Emily. He looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from fighting a boardroom, not a mountain. "Ms. Miller?" He nodded, removing his sunglasses. He looked at the baby, then back at Sarah. "You stayed." "I live here, Robert," Sarah replied. Her voice was calm. It lacked the defensive edge it had held months ago. Thorne handed her the binder. On the cover, stamped in official county ink, were the words, "Site Designation, Protected Geothermal Zone / Historical Stewardship." "We're not drilling," Thorne said, leaning against the porch railing. "The data from the landslide, and your grandmother's blueprints, they proved the instability. But they also proved the efficiency of this structure. The state university wants to send a team in the summer, not to extract anything, but to study how the house regulates heat. They're calling it a passive engineering marvel." Sarah ran her hand over the cover. The threat was gone. The mountain had spoken, and for once, the world had listened. "Thank you," she said softly. "Don't thank me," Thorne smiled, a genuine crooked thing. "You're the one who stood in front of an excavator." As the months passed, the house settled into a new rhythm. Visitors came, professors, students, hikers, but they didn't intrude. They came to learn. Sarah didn't become a recluse. She became a keeper. One evening, Sarah stood by the large west-facing window, watching the sunset bleed purple and gold over the valley. She thought about her old life in the city. She thought about the 5-year plan she used to obsess over. She even thought about David. The anger was gone. In its place was a quiet, profound clarity. She realized that when he left her, she had thought it was the end of her story. She had believed she was being discarded. But looking at the sturdy timber walls and feeling the weight of her sleeping daughter against her chest, Sarah understood the truth. The door closing behind her wasn't a rejection. It was a redirection. She hadn't been buried here. She had been planted. Sarah Miller pressed her hand against the warm adobe wall one last time. She wasn't the woman who had arrived here broken, driving a car packed with fear. She was the woman who had weathered the winter. She was the mother who had learned that true strength isn't about holding on to what you lost. It's about building on what remains. She wasn't running anymore. She was exactly where she was meant to be. Have you ever faced a moment in your life where everything fell apart, only to realize later that it was actually falling into place? Maybe a job loss, a breakup, or a failure that felt final at the time, but eventually led you to a better path? If this story resonated with you, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear about your own mountain moments. And if you want to hear more stories about resilience, hope, and the unexpected turns of life, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Sometimes the best stories are the ones where we have to write the ending ourselves. Thanks for watching.